By devoting just 6 minutes each weekday for 1 year, you can read through the entire New Testament using David's servant's daily devotional, HeavenWord Daily. Order your copy at heavenword.tv.
All right, welcome back to James chapter 5, where James is encouraging a very suffering church to know that the outcome of their faith is going to be positive. It's going to all be worth it. It doesn't really cost to pay. It doesn't really cost to serve God. That's what I want to say. It pays to serve God. There is a reward in the end. There is a prize, but it's sometimes we lose sight of that when we're in the midst of our trials and troubles and sufferings for the sake of Christ. And remember, we are talking here specifically about trials and troubles for the sake of Christ. There are other kinds of trials and troubles, and oftentimes I think that in our modern easy lives in Western culture, where Christianity is still somewhat accepted, we have a hard time relating to the concept of suffering for Christ. And so when you hear passages like we're reading in Matthew 5 being taught by modern preachers, when they read about the sufferings, they say, those days when your washing machine breaks down and your kids, get sick, all these things have nothing to do with suffering for Christ. Non-believers suffer in these same ways. And so it's really, really kind of twisting what the Word of God is saying. Hopefully, though, you have suffered for Christ, and you are suffering to some degree for Christ because, bare minimum, people aren't going to like you if you follow Jesus. And so that should cost you something. All right. And also should cost you in self-sacrifice and in discipline and so forth, whereas you're not wasting all your money like you used to before you came to Christ, but you're making a sacrifice. There's some suffering in every bit of sacrifice because you're relinquishing some of what God gives to you to help the poor and to spread the gospel and so forth. So there's that element of suffering, but it's not much suffering really to speak of, not compared to what these guys were going through, driven from their homes. Okay, now we come today to James chapter 5 and verse number 12. But above all, James says, and that's really an astounding statement. Boy, he must be getting ready to say something really weighty and important if it starts with above all, because he said some pretty tough things along here and, right to the point, finger in the nose type, exhortation. But above all, my brethren, do not swear. Wow. What does he mean? What kind of swearing is he talking about? Do not swear either by heaven or by earth or with any other oath, but let your yes be yes and your no, no, so that you may not fall under judgment. Now, we've already talked about this to a certain degree because we're talking about the judgment of the Lord and reasons that it could fall upon Christians. But again, this bears one more look. This is clearly based upon what Jesus himself taught in the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus was correcting a common practice amongst the religious leaders, and no doubt the average Jew would be following the lead of the religious leaders who had a certain code of things that if you swore by the temple, you weren't obligated to keep your oath, but if you swore by the gold in the temple, you were obligated to keep your oath. And what a nutty, nonsensical code, ethical code that is. They made it okay to lie and deceive and twist the truth, even when you make an oath, which carries that connotation of you're trying to convince someone that you actually are telling the truth. And Jesus said, all that's of evil. Anytime you have to swear by something else, to try to convince people that you're telling them the truth, it's a tacit admission that you can't be trusted. And that's why you have to resort to such tactics to convince people. If you are an honest person, yes is enough, no is enough, and your yes is yes and your no is no, and that's it. Okay? So apparently, that cultural practice, which was so prevalent among the Jewish culture. Of course, James is writing to people who are Jews, ethnic Jews, but new Christians, but such a inbred part of the fabric of their culture and daily lives that they had to be reminded of that, in this case, and it was still a big problem in the church. Otherwise, James wouldn't have addressed it, and he wouldn't have said, above all, So it was, you talk about some of the huge problems he already addressed in this letter, mostly sins of the tongue. Well, I guess this would be one more sin of the tongue, letting something come out that is not entirely true or honest. So let us take heart to that ourselves and make sure that we're, pure in the words that we speak, and that we're honest and truthful, even to our own detriment, okay? Because why do people lie? Because they're selfish, and they're trying to get something. Verse number 13, is anyone among you suffering? Well, there's that same theme again. What should you do? Does he say that you should make positive confessions until you can just confess your way out of that trouble? And there's the solution. No, surprisingly not. He said, let him pray. And nothing specific there about the prayer, and no promise necessarily that the prayer is going to bring a magic ending to your suffering. In this world you have tribulation, said Christ. Be of good cheer, I've overcome the world. People in James's day were losing their lives, suffering martyrdom because they had decided to follow Christ. And so obviously, when James says, pray, it's not one of those things where he's saying, that's the magic ticket out of your persecution. That's the magic ticket out of your sufferings for Christ. No, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that prayer is not effective in getting what God promises, standing in faith for what God promises. Absolutely, prayer is the key, and faith is key. That being said, you don't see those kinds of promises that God promises us no persecution. He promises us persecution. And so pray. That just means draw close to God, because you need to be thinking about him and what his divine purpose and his promise in the end, and that way you won't lose heart. All right, I'll see you next time. Don't lose heart.
HeavenWord 7 is made possible by the financial support of viewers like you. Thank you.